Kayla, a young black girl, hands the judge a letter during a court session. Judge Helen's heart shatters as she reads it, and the fate of the battle tilts in an unexpected direction. What does the letter contain that makes Judge Helen question everything she thought she knew? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Maria's gentle hands smoothed Kayla's hair as she carefully braided it, her fingers working with practiced ease. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the pair. Kayla, still sleepy-eyed but smiling, sat patiently at the table, her backpack ready beside her. "There you go, sweetie," Maria said, tying off the braid with a colorful hair tie. "All set for school." Kayla turned and wrapped her arms around Maria's waist, burying her face in her foster mother's soft sweater. "Thanks, Mom," she mumbled, her voice muffled but full of love. Maria's heart swelled with affection as it always did when Kayla called her Mom. She hugged the little girl back, savoring the moment. As she poured cereal into Kayla's favorite bowl, Maria's mind drifted back to that day. Claire, Kayla's birth mother, had been so frail in her hospital bed, her eyes filled with worry for the daughter she knew she wouldn't see grow up. Maria had promised her dear friend that she would love and protect Kayla as if she were her own. It was a promise she had kept with all her heart. "Mom?" Kayla's voice snapped Maria back to the present. "Can we have pizza for dinner tonight?" Maria smiled, pushing away her worries. "Sure, honey. That sounds perfect for Friday night." As Kayla happily munched on her breakfast, Maria busied herself packing a lunch. She carefully wrapped a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, cut into a heart shape just the way Kayla liked it, and tucked in a small note with a smiley face drawn on it. "Did you finish your math homework?" Maria asked, zipping up the lunch bag. Kayla nodded, her mouth full of cereal. She swallowed and said, "Yep. Ms. Johnson said I'm getting really good at fractions." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Maria beamed with pride. "I always knew you were a smart cookie." Kayla giggled at the familiar praise, her eyes twinkling with joy. Maria's heart ached at the sight. How could anyone think of separating them? The upcoming court case loomed in her mind like a dark cloud, threatening the happy life they had built together. But Maria was determined not to let her fears show. She plastered on a bright smile and helped Kayla into her jacket. "Ready to go, my little scholar?" "Ready," Kayla chirped, slinging her backpack over her shoulders. As they walked hand in hand to the bus stop, Maria marveled at how much Kayla had grown. She was no longer the tiny baby Maria had cradled in her arms, but a bright, loving 10-year-old with Claire's kind eyes and infectious laugh. At the bus stop, Kayla gave Maria one last hug before climbing aboard. "Love you, Mom," she called out, waving from the window. "Love you too, sweetie," Maria replied, waving back until the bus disappeared around the corner. Only then did she let her smile falter, her worry creeping back in. But she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and headed home. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same love and determination that had guided her for the past 10 years. Moments later, Maria's hands trembled as she opened the official-looking envelope that had arrived in the mail. Her heart raced as she unfolded the letter inside, her eyes scanning the formal language. With each word, her world seemed to crumble around her. The letter informed her that Elizabeth, Kayla's biological grandmother, had filed for custody of the child. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she read the shocking claim that Elizabeth had the legal right to raise Kayla. "This can't be happening," Maria whispered, sinking into a kitchen chair. She read the letter again, hoping she had misunderstood, but the words remained the same, cold and unyielding on the page. Elizabeth, a woman who had never been part of Kayla's life, was suddenly demanding full custody. Maria's mind reeled with questions. Why now? Why after all these years of silence? She thought of Claire, of the promise she had made to her dying friend. How could she have known that this day would come? Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as fear and confusion battled within her. She thought of Kayla, her sweet, loving girl who knew nothing of Elizabeth. How could she explain this to her? The thought of losing Kayla was unbearable. Maria's gaze fell on the refrigerator, covered with Kayla's artwork and school achievements. Each drawing, each perfect test score, was a testament to the life they had built together. She remembered Kayla's first steps, her first words, the countless nights she had held her through nightmares and illnesses. "No," Maria said aloud, her voice stronger now. "I won't let this happen." She stood up, wiping away her tears. She needed to be strong for Kayla. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. But the fear lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. What if the law favored blood relations? What if all the love she had given Kayla wasn't enough in the eyes of the court? Maria took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She needed to think clearly, to plan their next steps. But for now, she had to put on a brave face. Kayla would be home from school soon, and Maria was determined not to let her worry. As she folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, Maria's resolve strengthened. She would fight for Kayla with everything she had, because in her heart, she knew that love, not blood, was what truly made a family. Maria sat in her lawyer's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room felt small and stuffy, despite the large windows that let in the afternoon sunlight. Her lawyer, Mr. Johnson, a kind-faced man with graying hair, looked at her with sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Maria," he said gently, "but I have to be honest with you. In cases like these, blood relatives usually have a stronger claim in court." Maria felt her heart sink. She had hoped for better news, for some reassurance that everything would be okay, but Mr. Johnson's words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Especially," he continued, "if Elizabeth can prove she's financially stable and capable of providing for Kayla." Maria's eyes filled with tears. The thought of losing Kayla was unbearable. She thought of all the moments they had shared, all the love she had poured into raising this child. How could any court decide that blood was thicker than all of that? "But," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm the only mother Kayla has ever known. Doesn't that count for anything?" Mr. Johnson leaned forward, his face softening. "Of course it does, Maria. And we'll make sure the court understands that. But I want you to be prepared for a difficult fight." Maria nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. She took a deep breath, feeling a new resolve settle over her. She couldn't give up. She wouldn't. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "How do we fight this?" Mr. Johnson smiled, clearly impressed by her determination. "We need to gather evidence of the loving, stable home you've provided for Kayla. School records, testimonials from teachers and neighbors, photos of your life together. Anything that shows the court that Kayla is thriving under your care." Maria nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. She thought of Kayla's report cards, filled with glowing comments from her teachers. She remembered the photo albums documenting their vacations, birthdays, and quiet moments at home. "I can do that," Maria said, feeling a glimmer of hope. "I'll show them that Kayla is better off with me." As she left the lawyer's office, Maria felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Fear and uncertainty still lingered, but they were overshadowed by a fierce determination. She would fight for Kayla with everything she had. Maria knew it was time to talk to Kayla about the court case. Her heart felt heavy as she called her daughter into the living room. Kayla bounced in, her pigtails swinging, but her smile faded when she saw Maria's serious face. "Come here, sweetie," Maria said, patting the spot next to her on the couch. "We need to talk about something important." Kayla sat down, her big brown eyes looking up at Maria with worry. "Did I do something wrong?" Maria's heart melted. She wrapped an arm around Kayla's shoulders. "No, honey, you didn't do anything wrong. It's about something else." She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Do you remember how I told you that your birth mommy Claire went to heaven when you were a baby?" Kayla nodded slowly. "And you promised her you'd take care of me." "That's right," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "Well, there's someone else who was part of Claire's family. Her name is Elizabeth, and she's your grandmother." Kayla's forehead wrinkled in confusion. "I have a grandmother?" Maria nodded. "You do, and she wants to take care of you now." "But why?" Kayla asked, her voice small and scared. I don't know her. I want to stay with you. Maria pulled Kayla closer, feeling her tiny body tremble. I want that too, sweetheart. More than anything in the world. But there's going to be a special meeting called a court case. Some grown-ups will decide what's best for you. Tears welled up in Kayla's eyes. But you're my mommy, you take care of me. Maria's own eyes filled with tears. She cupped Kayla's face in her hands, looking into those beloved eyes. I am your mommy, Kayla, in every way that matters. And I promise you, I will fight with everything I have to keep us together. Kayla threw her arms around Maria's neck, holding on tight. I don't want to go with Elizabeth. I want to stay with you. Maria hugged her back just as fiercely. I know, baby, I know. And I want you to remember something very important. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says or decides, I will always be your mommy. Always. They sat there for a long time, holding each other. Maria stroked Kayla's hair, feeling the warmth of her daughter against her chest. Their bond, built over years of love and trust, felt unbreakable in that moment. Can you tell me about the good times we've had? Kayla asked in a small voice. Maria smiled through her tears. Of course, sweetheart. Remember when we went to the beach last summer? How you built that huge sandcastle? Kayla nodded, a tiny smile appearing on her face. And you helped me decorate it with shells. That's right, Maria said. And remember how we bake cookies together every Christmas? With extra chocolate chips, Kayla added, her smile growing. As they sat there, sharing memories and holding each other close, Maria felt their love wrap around them like a warm blanket. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew their bond would give them strength to face them together. After a few days, Judge Helen Carter sat in her chambers, reviewing the case files for the upcoming custody hearing. Her dark eyes scanned the documents with practiced efficiency, her brow furrowed in concentration. At 52, Helen had presided over countless family court cases, but something about this one tugged at her in a way she couldn't quite explain. She set down the papers and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the framed photo on her desk. It showed a young Helen, no more than 10, standing beside her adoptive parents. Their smiles were bright, but Helen's eyes held a hint of sadness that time had never fully erased. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, straightening in her seat. Her assistant poked her head in. Just a reminder, Your Honor, the Carter versus Thompson case starts in 30 minutes. Helen nodded. Thank you, Sarah, I'll be there shortly. As the door closed, Helen stood and smoothed her black robe. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, a dignified black woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her colleagues often praised her for her impartiality and wisdom on the bench, but as she stared at her reflection, Helen felt a flicker of uncertainty. You've handled hundreds of cases like this, she told herself firmly. This one is no different. Yet as she gathered her notes and headed for the courtroom, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that this case would challenge her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She thought back to her own adoption, to the questions that had haunted her for years about her birth parents and why they had given her up. Helen pushed those thoughts aside as she entered the courtroom. The familiar buzz of activity washed over her. Lawyers shuffling papers, spectators murmuring quietly. She took her seat at the bench, her face a mask of calm professionalism. All rise, the bailiff called out. The Honorable Judge Helen Carter presiding. As the room settled, Helen surveyed the faces before her. On one side sat Maria Thompson, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. Beside her was a young girl, Kayla, Helen presumed, who clung to Maria's hand. On the other side was an older woman, Elizabeth Carter, her chin raised defiantly. Helen cleared her throat. We are here today in the matter of Carter versus Thompson, a custody case concerning Kayla Thompson. I expect all parties to conduct themselves with respect and decorum. Let's begin. As the lawyers began their opening statements, Helen listened intently, taking careful notes. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm of emotions brewed. She found herself studying Kayla's face, seeing echoes of her own childhood fear and confusion. Helen shook her head slightly, reminding herself to focus on the facts of the case, not her personal feelings. Yet as the proceedings continued, She couldn't help but wonder how this case might force her to confront her own unresolved past. As the courtroom doors swung open, all eyes turned to witness Elizabeth Carter's entrance. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she strode towards the front, her head held high. Elizabeth's silver hair was neatly coiffed and her expensive suit spoke of wealth and status. Judge Helen Carter watched the woman's approach, her face a mask of impartiality. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she felt a flicker of unease. Elizabeth took her seat, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Kayla. The little girl shrank back, pressing closer to Maria, who wrapped a protective arm around her. "Your Honor," Elizabeth's lawyer began, "my client, Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, is Kayla's biological grandmother. She has a legal and moral right to raise her granddaughter." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes never leaving Kayla. "I made mistakes in the past," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I wasn't there for my daughter Claire when she needed me most, but I'm here now, and I want to make things right." Maria's grip on Kayla tightened, her heart pounding. She could feel the little girl trembling beside her. "Mrs. Thompson is a foster parent," Elizabeth's lawyer continued. "While we appreciate her care for Kayla, she has no legal claim to the child. Blood is thicker than water, Your Honor. Kayla belongs with her family." Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes glistening with what looked like unshed tears. "I've lost so much time already," she said, her voice catching. "I can't change the past, but I can give Kayla the future she deserves, a future with her real family." Judge Helen felt a twinge in her chest at those words. Real family. How many times had she wrestled with that concept in her own life? "I have the means to provide for Kayla," Elizabeth went on. "The best schools, the best opportunities, everything my daughter Claire should have had." Maria's lawyer stood up, ready to object, but Judge Helen held up a hand. "We'll hear from Mrs. Thompson's side shortly," she said. "Please continue, Mrs. Carter." Elizabeth nodded gratefully. "Your Honor, I know I'm asking for a lot, but I'm Kayla's grandmother. I'm her blood, and I promise to love her and care for her with everything I have." As Elizabeth spoke, her eyes never left Kayla. The little girl looked confused and scared, clinging to Maria like a lifeline. Judge Helen watched this silent exchange, her own emotions churning beneath her professional exterior. She knew the law often favored blood relatives in such cases, but as she looked at Kayla's frightened face, she couldn't help but remember her own fears as a child, torn between the family she knew and the biological ties she didn't understand. Maria stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way to the witness stand. She took a deep breath, her eyes finding Kayla's in the crowd. The little girl gave her a small, encouraging smile, and Maria felt a surge of strength. "Mrs. Thompson," her lawyer began, "please tell the court about your relationship with Kayla." Maria's voice was soft but steady. "I've been Kayla's mother since she was just a baby. I've loved her, cared for her, and raised her as my own for the past 10 years. She paused, her eyes misting over. "I was there for her first steps, her first words. I've kissed every scrape, celebrated every achievement. Kayla is my daughter in every way that matters." The courtroom was silent, hanging on Maria's every word. Even Elizabeth seemed affected, her brow furrowed as she listened. "Your Honor," Maria continued, her voice thick with emotion, "I made a promise to Claire, Kayla's biological mother, on her deathbed. I promised her that I would take care of Kayla, that I would love her with all my heart, and that I would never let her feel unloved or alone." Judge Helen leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Maria. Something in the woman's words stirred a long-buried memory in Helen's heart. Maria went on, her voice gaining strength. "I've kept that promise every single day. Kayla has grown up in a home filled with love, laughter, and security. She's thrived in school, made wonderful friends, and blossomed into an amazing little girl." Tears were flowing freely down Maria's cheeks now, but she didn't wipe them away. "I may not be Kayla's blood, but I am her mother in every other way. We share a bond that goes beyond genetics. I've been there for every moment of her life, good and bad." Judge Helen's impartial facade began to crack ever so slightly. She found herself thinking of her own childhood, of the loving adoptive parents who had raised her, and the biological mother she had never known. Your Honor, Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm not just asking for custody. I'm fighting for the right to continue being a mother to my daughter, to keep my promise to Claire, to give Kayla the love and stability she deserves. The courtroom was utterly silent as Maria's words hung in the air. Judge Helen felt a lump forming in her throat, her own unresolved feelings bubbling to the surface. Maria's gaze swept across the room from Elizabeth to Judge Helen, and finally resting on Kayla. I love Kayla with all my heart, she said, and I'm asking for the chance to keep being her mother. As the courtroom settled after Maria's emotional testimony, Judge Helen prepared to call a recess. The air was thick with tension, and it seemed that Elizabeth's legal claim might prevail. But just as Helen opened her mouth to speak, a small voice piped up from the gallery. Your Honor, wait, Kayla called out, her young face determined. I have something important. All eyes turned to the little girl as she stood up, clutching a slightly crumpled envelope in her hands. Maria looked at her daughter in surprise, while Elizabeth's brow furrowed in confusion. Judge Helen leaned forward, her stern expression softening slightly. What is it, Kayla? Kayla took a deep breath and walked towards the bench. It's a letter from my real mom, Claire. She wrote it before she died. A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elizabeth's eyes widened, and Maria's hand flew to her mouth in shock. Kayla handed the envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Helen. The judge carefully opened it, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she unfolded the paper inside. Your Honor, Kayla said, her voice small but clear, my mom wanted you to read this. She told me it was important. Helen nodded, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. After a moment, she cleared her throat and began to read aloud. To whom it may concern, my name is Claire and I am Kayla's mother. As I write this, I know my time is short. But there's one thing I need to make clear. My deepest wish is for Maria Thompson to raise my daughter. I've known Maria for years and I've seen the love and kindness in her heart. She's been by my side through my illness, caring for Kayla when I couldn't. I've watched how Kayla lights up around her, how safe and loved she feels. I chose Maria as Kayla's guardian because I trust her completely. She may not be related by blood, but she is family in every way that matters. Maria has promised to love Kayla as her own, to give her the stable, happy life I won't be able to provide. This is my final wish as Kayla's mother. I want my daughter to grow up surrounded by love, laughter, and warmth. I know in my heart that Maria will give her all of that and more. Please honor my decision. Let Maria continue to be the wonderful mother she already is to my precious Kayla. With all my love and trust, Claire. As Judge Helen finished reading, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Tears streamed down Maria's face, and even Elizabeth looked shaken. Kayla stood tall, her chin raised, as she waited for the judge's response. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as Judge Helen finished reading Claire's letter. The weight of the words hung in the air, touching everyone present. Helen's usually stoic demeanor faltered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. For the first time since the trial began, Helen felt her carefully constructed impartiality crumbling. The letter had struck a chord deep within her, stirring up memories of her own adoption and the unanswered questions about her birth mother's wishes. She found herself questioning whether the law's emphasis on blood relations should truly outweigh a mother's dying wish. Elizabeth sat frozen in her chair, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. She had never expected this, a clear statement of Claire's intentions that didn't include her at all. The realization that her daughter had deliberately chosen Maria over her own mother hit Elizabeth hard. Her lips trembled as she struggled to process this new information. Maria, overwhelmed with emotion, reached out and pulled Kayla into a tight embrace. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she whispered words of love and gratitude to the little girl who had just changed everything. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. What had seemed like a straightforward case of biological rights versus legal guardianship now took on a new dimension. The emotional impact of Claire's final wishes resonated with everyone present, challenging preconceived notions about family and motherhood. Judge Helen cleared her throat, her voice slightly unsteady as she addressed the court. This This is certainly an unexpected development. We will need time to consider the implications of this letter." She paused, visibly struggling to maintain her professional composure. "Court will recess for 1 hour while I review this new evidence." As Helen stood to leave, her eyes met Kayla's. In that moment, she saw not just a child caught in a legal battle, but a little girl who had carried the weight of her mother's last wishes, waiting for the right moment to share them. It was a depth of understanding that Helen hadn't expected to find in someone so young. Judge Helen Carter closed the door to her chambers and leaned against it, her shoulders sagging under the weight of emotions she'd long kept buried. The letter from Claire had stirred something deep within her, something she'd tried to ignore for years. With a heavy sigh, Helen made her way to her desk and sank into her chair. Her eyes fell on a small framed photo she kept hidden in the bottom drawer. It was the only picture she had of her birth mother, a faded, grainy image of a young woman with Helen's same warm brown eyes. Helen picked up the photo, her fingers tracing the outline of the woman's face. "Did you love me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you want me?" For years, Helen had prided herself on her ability to separate her personal feelings from her professional duties. But now, faced with Kayla's case and Claire's heartfelt letter, the lines were blurring. She closed her eyes, remembering the countless nights she'd spent as a child, wondering about her birth mother. Had she given Helen up willingly? Was it a difficult decision? Did she ever think about the daughter she'd left behind? Claire's letter to Kayla seemed to answer all those questions. For Kayla, at least, it was filled with love, hope, and a mother's deepest wishes for her child's future. Helen felt a pang of envy, quickly followed by shame for feeling that way. "The law is clear," Helen murmured to herself, trying to cling to the familiar comfort of legal precedent. "Blood relatives typically have priority in custody cases." But even as she said the words, they felt hollow. Claire's letter had changed everything. It wasn't just about biology anymore. It was about a mother's dying wish, about love that transcended blood ties. Helen stood up and began pacing her chambers, her mind racing. She'd always believed that the law provided structure and fairness in an often chaotic world. But now, she found herself questioning whether strict adherence to the law always led to justice. What if— Helen paused, hardly daring to voice the thought aloud. What if sometimes human emotion should take precedence over legal technicalities? The question hung in the air, challenging everything Helen had built her career upon. She thought about Maria and Kayla, their bond evident even in the formal setting of the courtroom. She thought about Elizabeth, suddenly wanting to be part of a granddaughter's life after years of absence. And she thought about herself, a successful judge who still carried the wounds of an uncertain childhood, who still longed for answers she might never get. Helen returned to her desk, her hand hovering over the law books she'd initially reached for. Instead, she pulled out a notepad and began to write, pouring out her conflicted thoughts and feelings. As she wrote, Helen realized that this case was forcing her to confront her own unresolved issues. It wasn't just about Kayla anymore. It was about Helen's own journey to understanding family, love, and the complex emotions that come with adoption. The next morning, Judge Helen Carter called for a private session with Maria. As Maria entered the judge's chambers, Helen noticed the weariness etched on her face, a testament to the emotional toll of the custody battle. "Please, have a seat," Helen said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Maria sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor," she said softly. Helen leaned forward, her eyes searching Maria's face. "I wanted to discuss Claire's letter," she began. "It was quite impactful." Maria nodded, a flicker of pain crossing her features. "Yes, it was," she agreed. There was a moment of silence before Maria took a deep breath. "Your Honor, there's something I need to tell you about that letter." Helen raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. I've known about the letter for years," Maria confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Claire gave it to me before she passed away." Helen's eyes widened in surprise. "You've had it all this time? Why didn't you bring it forward earlier in the case?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Because I didn't want to hurt Elizabeth," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "I know what it's like to lose a daughter. Claire might not have been my biological child, but I loved her as my own, and I saw how much pain Elizabeth was in, even if she didn't show it." Helen felt a lump form in her throat. She had expected many things, but this level of compassion caught her off guard. Maria continued, her words coming faster now. "I didn't want to use Claire's words against her own mother. I hoped that maybe Elizabeth and I could find a way to both be part of Kayla's life, that we could honor Claire's memory together." Helen sat back in her chair, stunned by Maria's revelation. Here was a woman who, despite facing the possibility of losing the child she had raised and loved, still found room in her heart for empathy towards her opponent. "That's incredibly selfless of you, Maria," Helen said softly. Maria shook her head, wiping away a tear. "It's not selfless, it's love. Love for Kayla, love for Claire's memory, and yes, even love for Elizabeth. Because she's part of Kayla's family too, even if she hasn't been there." Helen felt her own eyes growing moist. She thought about her own adoption, about the birth mother she never knew. Would her birth mother have shown such compassion? Would her adoptive parents have been so understanding if her birth mother had suddenly reappeared? "Thank you for sharing this with me, Maria," Helen said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. It gives me a lot to think about." As Maria left the chambers, Helen remained seated, overwhelmed by the depth of Maria's love and the complexity of the situation before her. The case that had seemed so clear-cut at the beginning now felt anything but, and Helen knew that her decision would require more than just a simple interpretation of the law. As the courtroom reconvened, Elizabeth sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of composure. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The weight of Claire's letter hung heavy in the air, its words echoing in Elizabeth's mind. Judge Helen Carter called the session to order, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a hint of the emotional turmoil she'd experienced. "Ms. Elizabeth, do you have anything you'd like to say in response to the letter we heard yesterday?" Elizabeth's hands trembled as she stood. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The courtroom watched in tense silence as she struggled to maintain her composure. Suddenly, a sob escaped her lips. I can't do this anymore," she choked out. The mask crumbled and Elizabeth's shoulders sagged. Tears streamed down her face as she finally let go of the facade she'd been holding onto so tightly. "I wasn't there," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I wasn't there for Claire when she needed me most. I abandoned her." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Maria's eyes widened in surprise, while Judge Helen leaned forward, listening intently. Elizabeth continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I was so consumed by my own guilt, my own pain. I couldn't face what was happening to Claire. And now she's gone, and I can never make it right." She turned to face Maria, her eyes pleading. "I thought if I could raise Kayla, it would somehow make up for failing Claire. But I see now. I see how wrong I was." The courtroom was silent, save for Elizabeth's quiet sobs. Even her lawyer looked stunned, unprepared for this sudden turn of events. "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth whispered, addressing both Maria and the memory of her daughter. "I'm so sorry for everything." As Elizabeth sank back into her chair, the courtroom remained hushed. The woman they had seen as a cold, calculating adversary was now revealed to be a broken mother, consumed by regret and desperate for redemption. Judge Helen's face softened as she watched Elizabeth. She saw in her the pain of a mother who had lost her child, a pain Helen could only imagine. The case that had seemed so black and white now swirled with shades of gray, each revelation adding another layer of complexity to an already heart-wrenching situation. Judge Helen Carter sat in her chambers, her fingers rubbing her temples as she tried to make sense of the emotional whirlwind that had swept through her courtroom. The case that had seemed so straightforward at first now felt like a tangled web of love, loss, and regret. She picked up the case file, flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. Legally speaking, Elizabeth's claim was strong. Blood relation often held significant weight in custody battles. But as Helen closed her eyes, she saw Maria's loving smile and Kayla's trusting gaze. She heard Claire's heartfelt words, entrusting her daughter to the woman who had been there when she couldn't be. What's the right thing to do? Helen whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. The judge stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. People bustled about their day, unaware of the life-changing decision weighing on her shoulders. Helen's mind drifted to her own childhood, to the questions she'd never had answered about her birth mother. Would she have wanted me to stay with my adoptive parents? Helen wondered aloud. Or would she have fought for me, like Elizabeth is fighting for Kayla? The parallel between her life and this case struck Helen like a physical blow. She'd always prided herself on her ability to remain impartial, to let the law guide her decisions. But now, for the first time in her career, she found herself questioning whether the law was truly serving the best interests of the child at the center of this case. Helen returned to her desk, picking up Claire's letter once more. The words seemed to leap off the page, filled with a mother's love and her dying wish. How could she ignore such a heartfelt plea? But then again, how could she disregard the legal system she'd sworn to uphold? The judge felt torn between two worlds, the rigid structure of the law and the messy, complicated reality of human emotions. She'd always believed that the law provided clarity in difficult situations, but now it felt like a cage, trapping her in a decision that went against every instinct she had. "There has to be a way," Helen murmured, her voice filled with determination. "There has to be a way to honor Claire's wishes and still work within the bounds of the law." As she prepared to return to the courtroom, Helen realized that this case was forcing her to confront not just the complexities of the legal system, but also her own unresolved feelings about family, love, and what it truly means to be a parent. As the courtroom settled into a tense silence, Judge Helen called Kayla to the stand. The young girl, her brown hair neatly braided and her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress, approached the witness box. Her eyes, wide with a mix of fear and determination, darted between Maria and Judge Helen. "Kayla," Judge Helen began, her voice softer than usual, "can you tell us how you feel about living with Maria?" Kayla took a deep breath, her lower lip quivering slightly. "She's my mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's always been there for me. She tucks me in at night and makes me chicken soup when I'm sick. She helps me with my homework and laughs at my silly jokes." Tears began to well up in Kayla's eyes as she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I know she's not my birth mom, but she's the only mom I've ever known, and I love her so much." A collective sniffle echoed through the courtroom. Maria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while Elizabeth sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Judge Helen leaned forward, her heart aching at the raw emotion in Kayla's voice. "And how do you feel about possibly living with Elizabeth?" Kayla's lower lip trembled as she glanced at Elizabeth. I don't know her. She might be nice, but..." The young girl's voice cracked as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I don't want to leave my mom. Please don't make me leave my mom." The courtroom was silent except for Kayla's soft sobs. Judge Helen felt a lump forming in her own throat as she watched the young girl's shoulders shake with each breath. "Thank you, Kayla," Helen said gently. "You've been very brave." As Kayla stepped down from the stand and rushed into Maria's waiting arms, Judge Helen felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. The sight of Kayla clinging to Maria, their tears mingling as they held each other tight, struck a chord deep within her. Helen realized with startling clarity just how much Kayla's future depended on her decision. This wasn't just about legal precedents or blood relations anymore. It was about a child's happiness, her sense of security, and the love that had nurtured her for 10 years. The judge's gaze swept across the courtroom, taking in the tear-stained faces and the palpable emotion that hung in the air. She knew that whatever decision she made would irrevocably change lives. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her, making her feel both powerful and terribly vulnerable. As the courtroom doors closed behind them, Maria and Elizabeth found themselves alone in the quiet hallway. The tension that had been building for weeks hung heavy in the air between them. Maria took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she turned to face Elizabeth. "Elizabeth," Maria began, her voice soft but steady, "I know this has been hard for you. I want you to know that I've always respected your role in Kayla's life." Elizabeth's eyes, rimmed with red from unshed tears, met Maria's gaze. For a moment, she seemed ready to argue, but something in Maria's gentle demeanor made her pause. Maria continued, "Claire chose me to raise Kayla. It wasn't a decision she made lightly. She wanted Kayla to have a stable, loving home." Elizabeth's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight seeming to drain out of her. I missed so much with Claire. I thought maybe with Kayla, I could make things right." Maria nodded, understanding flooding her features. "I know you're hurting, Elizabeth. Losing Claire was devastating for all of us. But Kayla isn't a way to fix the past. She's her own person, with her own needs and feelings." Tears began to roll down Elizabeth's cheeks as the weight of Maria's words sank in. "I never got to say goodbye to Claire," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought if I could just be there for Kayla, maybe—" Maria reached out, hesitantly placing a hand on Elizabeth's arm. "You can still be there for Kayla, Elizabeth, not as a replacement for her mother, but as her grandmother. She needs all the love she can get." Elizabeth looked at Maria, really looked at her for the first time. She saw the kindness in her eyes, the love for Kayla that radiated from her very being. Slowly, the realization dawned on her that she couldn't replace Maria in Kayla's heart, nor should she try. "I've been so selfish," Elizabeth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was thinking about what I needed, not what Kayla needs." Maria squeezed Elizabeth's arm gently. "It's not too late to be a part of her life, Elizabeth. We can find a way to make this work, together." As they stood there in the quiet hallway, a tentative understanding began to form between them. The battle lines that had been drawn started to blur, replaced by a shared love for the little girl whose future hung in the balance. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as both lawyers prepared to make their closing arguments. Maria sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes never leaving Kayla, who was seated nearby. Elizabeth, on the other side of the room, looked pale and conflicted, her earlier confidence seemingly shaken. Maria's lawyer stood first, his voice steady and compassionate. "Your Honor, we've heard testimony after testimony about the loving home Maria has provided for Kayla. For 10 years, she has been the only mother Kayla has known. She has nurtured her, cared for her, and loved her unconditionally." He paused, looking directly at Judge Helen. "But more than that, Maria has honored Clary's dying wish. Clara chose Maria to raise her daughter, trusting her with the most precious gift a mother can give. Maria has fulfilled that promise every single day." The lawyer's voice softened as he continued. "We're not just talking about legal guardianship here. We're talking about a bond that goes beyond blood. A bond of love, trust, and family that has been built over a decade." As Maria's lawyer sat down, Elizabeth's attorney rose. His approach was more formal, his voice carrying a note of authority. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the care Maria has provided, we must not forget the importance of family bonds and blood relations." He paced slowly in front of the bench. "Elizabeth is Kayla's biological grandmother. She shares a genetic connection that cannot be denied. Family ties are sacred, and the law recognizes the importance of maintaining these connections whenever possible." The lawyer's voice grew more passionate as he argued, "Elizabeth may have made mistakes in the past, but she's here now, ready to provide for Kayla and give her the family connection she deserves. Blood is thicker than water, Your Honor, and Elizabeth is Kayla's true family." As the lawyers finished their arguments, all eyes turned to Judge Helen. The weight of the decision she had to make was visible in the lines of her face. She looked from Maria to Elizabeth, then to Kayla, her eyes filled with a mix of compassion and turmoil. Helen knew that her ruling would change lives forever. The law pulled her in one direction, while her heart tugged her in another. She thought of her own adoption, of the unanswered questions about her birth mother that had haunted her for years. With a deep breath, Helen prepared to make her decision, knowing that no matter what she chose, it would be heart-wrenching for someone in the room. Judge Helen took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the courtroom. The weight of her decision hung heavy in the air. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. After careful consideration of all the evidence and testimonies presented, I am ready to deliver my verdict, she began. This case has challenged not only the letter of the law, but also the very essence of what family means. Helen's gaze settled on Kayla, who sat nervously between Maria and Elizabeth. In matters concerning the welfare of a child, we must always prioritize what is in the best interest of that child. Kayla has known only one mother for the past 10 years, Maria. Maria's eyes welled with tears as Helen continued. The love, care, and stability that Maria has provided for Kayla are undeniable. She has honored Claire's dying wish and raised Kayla as her own, creating a bond that goes beyond biological connection. Helen turned to Elizabeth, her expression softening. However, I also recognize the importance of family ties and the desire to right past wrongs. Elizabeth, your efforts to be part of Kayla's life are commendable. Taking a deep breath, Helen delivered her ruling. It is the decision of this court to grant full custody of Kayla to Maria. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by Maria's quiet sob of relief. But Helen wasn't finished. Additionally, I am ordering that Elizabeth be granted regular visitation rights. This will allow her the opportunity to build a relationship with Kayla and be part of her life moving forward. The judge's voice wavered slightly as she concluded, "It is my hope that this ruling strikes a balance between the law and the heart, honoring both the loving home Maria has provided and the biological connection Elizabeth represents." As Helen finished speaking, the courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions. Maria hugged Kayla tightly, tears streaming down both their faces. Elizabeth sat stunned for a moment before a small, sad smile crossed her face, acknowledging the fairness of the decision. Judge Helen watched the scene unfold, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had made her decision balancing the complexities of law and emotion, hoping to provide the best possible future for Kayla. As Judge Helen's words settled over the courtroom, Maria's body began to tremble. The weight of fear and uncertainty that had been pressing down on her for months suddenly lifted, leaving her overwhelmed with relief. Tears sprang to her eyes, and before she could stop them, they were streaming down her face. "Oh, thank you," Maria whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much." She turned to Kayla, who was looking up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. Maria pulled her close, wrapping her arms tightly around the little girl she had raised and loved as her own. The courtroom faded away as Maria held Kayla, their hearts beating in sync. "We're going to stay together, sweetheart," Maria said softly, her tears falling into Kayla's hair. "Just like I promised." Kayla hugged Maria back fiercely, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. "I love you, Mom," she mumbled, her voice muffled but full of love. Maria's heart swelled at Kayla's words. She pulled back slightly, cupping Kayla's face in her hands and looking into her eyes. "I love you too, my sweet girl, more than anything in this world." The courtroom around them was a blur of movement and sound, but Maria and Kayla remained in their own bubble of joy. Maria stroked Kayla's hair, her touch gentle and loving. She couldn't stop the tears from falling, but for the first time in months they were tears of happiness. "Your Honor," Maria said, turning to face Judge Helen. Her voice was thick with emotion, but her words were clear and heartfelt. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for seeing our love." Judge Helen nodded, a small smile on her face as she watched the tender moment between mother and daughter. The love between Maria and Kayla was palpable, filling the courtroom with a warmth that touched everyone present. Maria hugged Kayla close again, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. She had fought so hard for this moment, and now it was here. They were together, and they would stay together. Maria silently renewed her promise to Claire, vowing to continue loving and nurturing Kayla with all her heart. As they held each other, Maria and Kayla's joy radiated throughout the courtroom, a testament to the power of love and the strength of their bond. As the courtroom began to clear, Elizabeth sat alone on a bench, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The weight of the verdict pressed heavily upon her, and tears silently rolled down her cheeks. She watched as Maria and Kayla embraced, their joy a stark contrast to her own sorrow. But as Elizabeth observed their interaction, something shifted within her. The love between Maria and Kayla was undeniable, a bond forged through years of care and devotion. Elizabeth's heart ached, not just for her loss but for the realization of what she had missed with her own daughter, Claire. With a deep breath, Elizabeth stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but her resolve was strong. She slowly made her way towards Maria and Kayla, her steps hesitant but determined. "Maria?" Elizabeth's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Maria looked up, her arms still protectively around Kayla. Her expression was guarded, but she didn't turn away. Elizabeth swallowed hard, fighting back fresh tears. I owe you an apology," she began, her voice trembling. "I was wrong to try and take Kayla away from you." Maria's eyes widened in surprise, but she remained silent, allowing Elizabeth to continue. "I wasn't there for Claire when she needed me most," Elizabeth admitted, her voice breaking. "And I foolishly thought I could make up for that by claiming Kayla. But I see now. I see how much you love her, how much she loves you." Kayla peeked out from Maria's embrace, her eyes curious as she watched the exchange between the two women. Elizabeth knelt down, bringing herself to Kayla's eye level. "Kayla, sweetie, I'm sorry for all the trouble I've caused. Maria is your mother in every way that matters. She's done an incredible job raising you, and I was wrong to try and change that." Turning back to Maria, Elizabeth's eyes were filled with genuine remorse. "You've given Kayla everything I couldn't give Claire. You've been the mother she needs and deserves. I'm truly sorry for trying to come between you two." Maria's expression softened, touched by Elizabeth's sincere words. She reached out, gently touching Elizabeth's arm. "Thank you, Elizabeth. That means a lot to hear." Elizabeth nodded, wiping away a tear. I hope that maybe, in time, I could still be a part of Kayla's life. Not to replace you, never that. But perhaps as a grandmother, who can love her too?" Maria smiled softly, her eyes warm with understanding. "I think we can work something out. Kayla deserves to know her family, all of her family." As the courthouse emptied and the echoes of the day's proceedings faded, Judge Helen Carter found herself alone in her chambers. She sank into her leather chair, her usually composed demeanor giving way to a wave of emotions she had long kept at bay. The case of Maria and Kayla had touched something deep within her, stirring up feelings she had buried for years. Helen's eyes drifted to a small framed photo on her desk, a picture of her adoptive parents. She picked it up, running her thumb over the smiling faces. "Family," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "It's more than just blood, isn't it?" For years, Helen had struggled with her own adoption story. She had always wondered about her birth mother, imagining scenarios of why she had been given up. But now, as she reflected on Maria's unwavering love for Kayla, something shifted inside her. Helen closed her eyes, remembering the tears in Maria's eyes as she spoke about her promise to Claire. She thought of Kayla's heartfelt testimony, the love that radiated from her every word when she spoke about Maria. And then there was Elizabeth, who had finally recognized the depth of Maria's bond with Kayla. A tear slipped down Helen's cheek, catching her by surprise. She hadn't cried in years, always maintaining a stoic facade. But now, the emotions flowed freely. "Love," Helen murmured. "That's what makes a family." For the first time in her life, Helen felt a sense of peace about her own adoption. She realized that the love her adoptive parents had given her was just as real, just as powerful as any biological connection. The case had forced her to confront her own feelings, and in doing so, had brought her a clarity she had never expected. Helen stood up, walking to the window. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the city, and she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had made the right choice in the courtroom today, not just for Kayla and Maria, but for herself as well. A small smile played on Helen's lips as she turned back to her desk. She picked up her pen, ready to finalize her decision. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace with who she was and where she came from. The case had changed her, healing a wound she hadn't even realized was still open. As the courthouse emptied and the last echoes of footsteps faded away, Maria and Kayla lingered in the hallway. Kayla clutched a small, colorful package in her hands, her eyes wide with anticipation. Maria squeezed her shoulder gently, offering a reassuring smile. "Are you ready, sweetie?" Maria asked softly. Kayla nodded, her pigtails bouncing. "I hope she likes it," she whispered. Together, they approached Judge Helen's chambers. Maria knocked softly on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, they heard a gentle, "Come in," from inside. As they entered, they saw Judge Helen sitting at her desk, a thoughtful expression on her face. She looked up, surprise flickering across her features as she saw Maria and Kayla. "Your Honor," Maria began, her voice filled with emotion, "we wanted to thank you for everything." Kayla stepped forward, holding out the small package. "I made this for you," she said shyly. Judge Helen's eyes softened as she accepted the gift. "That's very kind of you, Kayla. Thank you." With careful hands, Helen unwrapped the package. Inside was a handmade bracelet, woven with threads of blue, green, and purple. Hanging from the center was a small charm in the shape of a heart. "It's beautiful," Helen said, her voice catching slightly. She looked at Kayla, who was watching her anxiously. "Did you make this yourself?" Kayla nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "The colors reminded me of your robe," she explained. "And the heart, well, because you listened to your heart." Helen felt a lump form in her throat. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, admiring how it caught the light. "I'll treasure this always, Kayla. Thank you." Maria stepped forward, placing a hand on Kayla's shoulder. "We wanted you to know how much your decision means to us. You've given us our family." Helen stood up, moving around her desk. For a moment she hesitated, then opened her arms. Kayla rushed into them, hugging the judge tightly. Helen closed her eyes, savoring the moment of connection. When they parted, Helen knelt down to Kayla's level. "You have a wonderful mother, Kayla. And now you have a grandmother who loves you too. Family comes in all forms, and you're very lucky to have so much love in your life." Kayla nodded solemnly. "I know. And now you're part of our family too." Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. She stood up, looking at Maria. "Thank you both. This case, it's meant more to me than you could know." Maria reached out, squeezing Helen's hand. "We're the ones who should be thanking you, Your Honor. You've given us everything." As Maria and Kayla turned to leave, Helen called out softly, "And please, when we're not in court, call me Helen." As the dust settled from the emotional court battle, Elizabeth and Maria found themselves in unfamiliar territory. The two women, once adversaries, now stood side by side, united by their shared love for Kayla. One sunny afternoon, Elizabeth arrived at Maria's house for her first scheduled visit. She hesitated at the door, a bouquet of flowers clutched tightly in her hands. Maria opened the door, her smile tentative but genuine. "Come in, Elizabeth," Maria said warmly. "Kayla's been looking forward to your visit all day." Elizabeth stepped inside, taking in the cozy home filled with photos and mementos of Kayla's life. Her eyes lingered on a picture of Claire, her late daughter, and she felt a pang of regret mixed with hope. Kayla bounded into the room, her face lighting up at the sight of her grandmother. "Grandma Elizabeth!" she exclaimed, rushing forward for a hug. As Elizabeth embraced her granddaughter, she met Maria's eyes over Kayla's head. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They both knew that this was the beginning of something new and beautiful. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth became a regular presence in their lives. She joined them for family dinners, helped Kayla with her homework, and even assisted Maria in planning Kayla's upcoming birthday party. One evening, as Kayla was engrossed in a book, Maria and Elizabeth sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset. "I want to thank you, Maria," Elizabeth said softly, "for loving Kayla so completely, for being the mother she needed when I couldn't be there for Claire." Maria reached out and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "And thank you for becoming the grandmother Kayla deserves. We're all lucky to have you in our lives." As the weeks turned into months, their unconventional family unit grew stronger. Elizabeth's visits became cherished occasions, filled with laughter and shared memories. Maria remained Kayla's rock, her constant source of love and support, while Elizabeth added an extra layer of warmth and wisdom to their lives. Together, they created new traditions. Sunday brunches became a weekly affair, with Elizabeth teaching Kayla how to make Claire's favorite pancakes. Maria organized family game nights, where competitive spirits ran high and giggles echoed through the house. As the seasons changed, so did Elizabeth's understanding of what truly made a family. She watched Maria and Kayla together, noticing the little things that spoke volumes about their bond. The way Maria's eyes lit up when Kayla shared a story from school, or how Kayla instinctively reached for Maria's hand when she felt unsure. One crisp autumn day, Elizabeth arrived at Maria's house for their weekly visit. She found Maria and Kayla in the backyard, raking leaves into a giant pile. Kayla's laughter rang out as she jumped into the leaves, scattering them everywhere. "Grandma Elizabeth," Kayla called out, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Come join us." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, then smiled and set down her purse. She picked up a rake and joined in the fun, her heart warming at the simple joy of the moment. As they worked and played, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice the easy rhythm between Maria and Kayla. They moved in sync, anticipating each other's needs without a word. It was a dance of love and trust that had been perfected over years. Later, as they sat on the porch sipping hot cocoa, Elizabeth turned to Maria. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think that being family was all about blood, but watching you with Kayla, I see now that it's so much more than that." Maria looked at her, surprise and warmth in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "The way you love her, the way you care for her. It's everything I hoped Claire would have. Everything I wish I could have given her." Her voice caught, and she blinked back tears. "You're more of a mother to Kayla than I ever was to Claire." Maria reached out and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "You're here now," she said gently. "That's what matters." Elizabeth nodded, her heart full. She watched as Kayla came running up to Maria, showing her a colorful leaf she'd found. The love between them was palpable, a living, breathing thing that filled the air around them. In that moment, Elizabeth realized that family wasn't defined by DNA or legal documents. It was built on love, trust, and the countless small moments that knit hearts together. Maria and Kayla had that in spades, and now Elizabeth was part of it too. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had found her place in this beautiful, unconventional family, and she was grateful for every moment. The sun shone brightly on a perfect summer day as Maria, Elizabeth, and Kayla spread out a colorful blanket on the lush grass of the park. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and the sweet scent of blooming flowers. It was the ideal setting for a family picnic, one that would have seemed impossible just a few months ago. As Maria unpacked the picnic basket, laying out sandwiches and fresh fruit, Elizabeth helped Kayla set up a kite nearby. The sight of grandmother and granddaughter working together brought a warm smile to Maria's face. She marveled at how far they had come, from courtroom adversaries to a loving, if unconventional, family unit. A familiar figure approached from across the park, her long robes replaced by a casual sundress. Judge Helen Carter walked towards them, a gentle smile on her face. Maria waved her over, genuinely happy to see the woman who had played such a crucial role in their lives. "Judge Helen!" Kayla exclaimed, abandoning her kite to run towards the newcomer. "You came!" Helen's smile widened as she bent down to hug the excited child. "Of course I did, sweetheart. I wouldn't miss this for the world." As Helen settled onto the blanket, she couldn't help but observe the easy interaction between Maria, Elizabeth, and Kayla. There was a warmth and comfort between them that spoke of true family bonds, forged not by blood but by love and understanding. Maria offered Helen a plate of food, which she accepted gratefully. As they ate, Helen watched Kayla flit between Maria and Elizabeth, sharing stories and jokes with both women equally. The love in both women's eyes as they gazed at the child was unmistakable. A sense of peace washed over Helen as she witnessed the scene before her. The decision she had made in that courtroom months ago had been the right one, She knew that now without a doubt. Love, not blood, had truly shaped this family, molding them into something beautiful and unique. As the afternoon wore on, Helen found herself drawn into the family's activities. She helped Kayla fly her kite, laughed at Elizabeth's jokes, and shared quiet moments with Maria. With each passing minute, Helen felt the last remnants of her own unresolved feelings about her adoption melt away. Kayla suddenly ran towards Helen, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Judge Helen, come play with us," she called out, reaching for Helen's hand. Helen smiled, her heart full of contentment. As she allowed Kayla to pull her to her feet, she knew that her own journey of healing was complete. Here, sharing in the joy of this new united family, Helen had found the closure she had been seeking for so long. If you enjoyed the story of Mrs. Elizabeth, Maria, and Kayla, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.